I have to make a confession firstly. I've packed in more content in this presentation than we can get through in the available time, so we are going to probably run out. Also, if you read the program, you'll see that I also overpromised and said that I was going to talk about harm reduction for a huge range of drugs. I was being a bit grandiose that day in the office. I can't get through it all. What I am going to talk about today, though, is about practical harm reduction, about an area that I'm really passionate about, and it's something that in our alcohol and drug practice, we have in some ways neglected the nitty-gritty of the work, which is why this is the Cameron's Top Tips is what we call this. But let's get into it. I'd firstly want to acknowledge traditional owners as well and just pay my respects to the elders past and present. I won't go into who we are. We've got a trade stall outside. Please come and see us. We don't work with young people in Dovetail. We work with services to support them in engaging with young people. So we work with a really broad range from alcohol and drug treatment services through to schools, pretty much anyone. There's our website, dovetail.org.au. Do subscribe. The content that I can't get through today, we are planning a series of webinars over the next 6 months where I'll go into much more detail on this sort of area. Harm reduction. How do we provide good harm reduction advice? Not really like that, with a finger being shaken. We've done really well with harm reduction in Australia around injecting drug use. And there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, HIV is a pretty serious illness, and it gave us a really good kick in the pants and made us get it together. But also, when we did our response to HIV, one of the cornerstones of that was engaging the affected community, was actually funding drug user organisations around Australia to get the injecting drug users involved in the response. So it meant that when our services were developing, we got harm reduction advice coming straight from the horse's mouth, from people who actually inject drugs. We employed peer educators and got them to educate their friends. So in a lot of ways, I see that as, if that's our gold standard, what have we done with harm reduction for all of the other drugs, like cannabis and ecstasy? One thing we haven't done really well is engage the affected community. The people who use those drugs haven't been really well involved in the response. Because of that, we've seen some harm reduction advice dreamt up by very well-meaning people that doesn't actually connect with the reality of the drug using culture and the context in which people use drugs like cannabis, etc. So this is what I want to talk about today, is take you through a bit of a journey into Aussie bong smoking culture and have a think about the harms involved in some of those unique situations and what we as workers can do to advise our clients of safer ways of using and minimising harms, but also to try and get us up to speed with the rapidly evolving technology in this area. Obviously, with legalised pot in a few American states, some of the technology around cannabis consumption is really moving quickly. And as workers, we've got to try and catch up with that, because some of these technologies are likely to be really useful. Some might turn out to be harmful, but we've got to keep up to speed with all of that stuff. There's just some basics, how to do good harm reduction advice. And what I'm going to talk about today pretty much is about the message, is what we're talking about. Obviously, you can't give harm reduction advice to someone unless you've got a bit of a relationship and rapport, etc. So I'm going to assume that as AOD workers we know this and we're all good at that stuff. But the other issue we have with harm reduction advice is that we have to balance between our aspirations versus the realities. A good example of that is the way injecting drug use would talk about hierarchies of safety. They'd talk about the hierarchy of safety for different injecting locations. So, obviously in the arm is safest. If that doesn't work, maybe down to the hand. And we have these sort of hierarchies which accept the various problems people have in sometimes implementing that. So I think we've got to think about our hierarchies for these other drugs as well. But also, obviously, alcohol and drug-related harm occurs through this combination of the drug, the set, and the setting. There's unique harms to do with substances. The set refers to the internal circumstance of that young person, setting external, environmental factors. So when we're doing any harm reduction advice, there's that balance between those three. I'm going to talk today about the drug. That's what I'm mostly interested in today. There is a little pile of marijuana mixed with tobacco. The first problem we have with reducing harm from pot smoking is the tobacco. We probably haven't been so good at incorporating discussions about mixing pot and tobacco in our assessments with people, and I think we probably need to start doing that. Australia, if we look at pot smoking culture globally, Australia is a little bit unique in our mixing tobacco pretty much consistently all the time, and in a lot of cases mixing a fair amount of tobacco in with that cannabis as well. A lot of young people would report mixing 70-30 ratio of tobacco to their cannabis because they can't afford pot. So they mix lots of tobacco with it so they can stretch it out. We've got to start having conversations with people about mixing the tobacco, about spin, or different cultural groups use different language. In Queensland we talk about spin. How much spin would you mix in your pot? What's the sort of ratio you would use? Why would you kind of do that? But understanding that if this is our foundation, we've got to do something about that. There's a lot of research showing us that this combination of tobacco and cannabis is more harmful than either of those drugs on their own. We know that the respiratory harms are in some ways amplified by the combination of the two. There's also, if you're working with someone who might be cannabis dependent and they're mixing lots of tobacco in, they're nicotine dependent as well. And how are we going to manage nicotine dependence and cannabis dependence together at the same time? It's something that we've really got to think about. Now this is where I get on my high horse. I still see traditional cannabis harm reduction literature out there which recommends joint smoking as the safest route of administration for cannabis. Now, that is technically correct because some nice person in a lab with a white coat rolled a nice joint in the lab and stuck it into a machine and tested the content of that smoke. And what they found was relatively high levels of THC in it compared to the other tars. When a water pipe has been plugged into a similar machine, it's actually the water is stripping out some of the THC. Now that means people need to smoke more cones out of a bong to get the same effect as compared to a joint, right? Theoretically, all fine. This has led to this sort of advice that joints might be safer than bongs. The biggest problem we've got with that is that people who roll joints are mixing heaps of tobacco in with that. So if we advise people that joints are the safest route of administration, we're actually inadvertently kind of saying that you should mix tobacco as well. It's an example of where our theoretical harm reduction research from well-meaning researchers in the lab hasn't actually translated to practice where people are trying to smoke pot. If you've ever rolled a joint such as this one with purely cannabis, it won't burn very well, particularly with chunky hydroponic pot, which most people are smoking these days. Young people will also tell you that smoking joints is not an economically efficient way of smoking it because they're using too much cannabis in their joints. So they're not going to implement that strategy for those reasons. So, here we go. The Australian bong. This is from the Powerhouse Museum collection in Sydney. Found in a gutter in Ultimo, Sydney, a significant example of the ephemera of life in the 1990s. Nicely decorated, pretty crusty. You can see it's a bit of garden hose that's been stuffed into the hole there. If we got a close-up, a lot of times the hole might be sealed off with blue tack or something else to hold it in place. You can see it hasn't been cleaned for a while. It's pretty crusty. This sort of smoking utensil is a fairly unique Australian device. It's a unique little Australian innovation, one might say. Go Australia. But associated with this particular utensil is probably a whole bunch of harms that we don't really understand as well as we should. And given that we've got such high rates of pot smoking, why do we not know what the harms might be from this? That we still at this point, in 2015, we have not plugged an Aussie bong into a machine to find out what comes out of it. Is there vapour from that hose? If that hose gets really hot and a group of people pass that bong around, are there plastic fumes in the smoke? Yes or no? We actually don't know that. No one's done the research, and we can assume that there probably is. That probably is the case, but we don't know that. It might be the case that maybe a dirty bong could be safer than a clean one. Maybe a dirty bong that's coated in all of that oily resin might prevent some of the plastic going into the smoke. Ultimately, we don't know though, and so I find it a bit weird that in 2015 we still can't answer that question when so many people are sucking on these devices every single day. To take it a little step further, we've also got a fairly unique pot smoking culture in Australia with the bong. The way that an Australian person would sit down and smoke a bong like that would be to pack it to the top and pull it in one hit. And it would be inhaled deeply and it would be held deeply and the bong would be returned to the next person cleared or empty. That's a fairly unique Aussie thing. a lot of other countries, overseas, the culture, pot smoking culture would be toke pass. It wouldn't be one massive inhalation and holding it right in and putting it back down. Now, not a surprise, Aussie macho culture has been infused with our pot smoking culture. There's a real macho, thing about pulling a bong properly and putting it back down again. Now, there's likely more harms involved in that we've got people holding smoke way longer than they need to, way deeper in their lungs than they have to as well. So what can we advise about this? Now, I've got a video. I hope this works. I spent an afternoon on YouTube trying to find an example of the Aussie bong smoking culture for you to demonstrate for those who haven't seen it before. And here we go. This is a group of young folk pulling a bong. I apologise for the bad language, but we're alcohol and drug workers. I'm sure we can handle it. Oh, there we go.
Session's ready.
Session's ready. Great example of Aussie bong culture. That's a different way of smoking pot to other countries. And I don't know, someone needs to do an ethnographic study of this stuff to work this out, but we haven't really done that before. There is something unique about our culture that we need to talk about. If we want to reduce harm from pot smoking, how is it that we intervene in this sort of context? Now you can see he talked about chopper's privileges, right? Which is the whoever chops goes first. The ritual and the etiquette of smoking pot is quite regulated. These guys are enforcing it on each other. How is it that we as workers can manipulate that culture in a way that might reduce harm? There's a lot of opportunities for us to do that somehow. We've looked at it a lot with alcohol, but we've never considered it with drugs like cannabis. So obviously one of the bits of advice we can give is maybe don't use these Orchie bottles, these plastic bottles with garden hose poking out of them. So what next? I mean, there's a large glass bong for you there, which is obviously doesn't have the risks of all of the plastic. What it does have though is it still allows this sort of pulling it in one hit kind of process. The round chambers in a lot of these glass bongs will actually trap a lot of the smoke until the shot is let off to allow a big hit of cannabis. So possibly this sort of glass bong may turn out to be not the ideal. The glass pipes are really popular, particularly in the US. That really does involve a toke pass action where someone would just have a small inhalation and pass it on to their friends. Also often not mixed with tobacco either. A lot of the people smoking with glass devices would say that the smoking out of glass retains the flavour of the cannabis, and which you wouldn't pollute with using tobacco with it as well. But this is probably one of the options. An easy option that we should be advising people is to think about not using plastic homemade bongs and switching to a purchased device like this. By the way, I should say that it is illegal in Queensland. On the left there, that's not a bong, that's an oil pourer. But we've also seen the growth in vaporizers as well, and I think as workers we've got to catch up with the vaporizing technology because it's moving really quickly. This is a Volcano Vaporizer. You can see in the interest of science he is wearing a white coat. This is science right there. He's got a Volcano Vaporizer. Now, vaporizers heat the cannabis to just below combustion. We know that most of the tar in cannabis smoke occurs because of combustion when you burn it. The vaporizers like this would heat the cannabis to just below combustion, about 190 degrees Celsius or up to 200 degrees Celsius. So what looks like smoke in the bag there is actually vapor. We know from where the Volcano Vaporizer has been plugged into a machine and tested, there's very low rates of the potentially carcinogenic tars in that mixture of vapour. We know that people who use vaporizers report that they find they get very intoxicated. It doesn't reduce the effect of it. So we know that people will use them. The barrier is the price, and at $420 no one's buying that, particularly young people. But since cannabis has become legalised in the US, that's starting to change, and the innovation is moving very quickly. These are a couple of handheld vaporizers about the size of an iPhone. Also still quite expensive, but these allow you to set the temperature and inhale. They're all rechargeable lithium-ion batteries. This one, the PAX Vaporizer, looks like it was made by Apple. It's a handheld lithium-ion rechargeable vaporizer which can slip into your pocket. The cannabis goes into the left-hand end in a little oven which heats it to a preset temperature, and then there's a little chamber that runs through the centre and people just inhale the vapour, thus reducing a huge amount of the toxic tar in that. This one conveniently disguised as a Ventolin puffer. That's really ironic, isn't it? The Puffit version 2. USB charged off your laptop, $99. So the price of vaporizers is coming down, and because of that, we're going to start seeing them a lot more in our work. You're going to come across people that are telling you they're primarily using vaporizers for their cannabis. It's starting to happen already, and we're going to start seeing it a lot more. This is another one. This is the Magic Flight wooden vaporizer, also relatively cheap at $120. At this stage, the research is still very mixed on vaporizers. There's a lot of research showing that the tar is successfully removed. There's one study which did show high rates of ammonia in one particular sample, and that study's a very interesting one because they used 2 samples of cannabis in their vaporizer test. One of them was standard NIDA research pot, 4% THC from NIDA in the US. The other was a street sample of cannabis, indeterminate THC ratio, whatever. What they found in that study was the street cannabis produced very high levels of ammonia in the vapour. The NIDA cannabis had very, very low levels of ammonia. So that's the only study that's found that. But it's very interesting that maybe there's something about different types of pot, or maybe there is something about the fertiliser that's been used. Is there leftover ammonia in the product that's got into the final stage? So there's still some more research to go in that area. But at this stage, we do know that it does remove the tar from the cannabis. Okay. That's my rant about pot. Now we'll turn to some of the other drugs that are also relatively commonly used. And LSD, that's a big sheet of LSD blotter. You can see the little perforations there on the blotter. LSD in Australia has traditionally been only LSD, partly because the only drug strong enough to fit on a tab on a piece of blotter paper is LSD. So people who take acid, which in Australia, relatively high rates of use of LSD, we get people who take acid believe that if they take a cardboard tab of something and something happens, it's acid. It's either LSD or nothing, because there's no other drugs potent enough to be active in that dose range. But that has changed with the advent of the NBOME series of hallucinogens. This is a sample of 2,5-I-NBOME, found in Sydney. This is more 2,5-I-NBOME in Sydney. So what about this? NBOME is a much more dangerous substance than LSD itself. We've had several deaths in Australia and overseas from people consuming NBOME, believing it's LSD. You might recall Henry Kwan, the young fella from Sydney who took a dose, purchased off Silk Road and jumped in front of his parents. Those sorts of harms have been happening all over the world from that drug. Just recently, it's European summer at the moment, there's been some field testing that's been done at music festivals in Europe in the last month or so. At one particular festival, 80% of the LSD samples were NBOME, with no LSD, NBOME only. That's a massive concern coming into our next music festival season when the LSD comes out, that people are taking what they think is LSD and it's not. One of the problems with the NBOME hallucinogens that some of them are most likely MAOI inhibitors, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which means combined with other drugs like ecstasy, extremely dangerous. So Recently, the people who produced the Easy Test field reagent test kits have released an LSD test to confirm the presence of LSD. We're trying to get the word out that this test does exist and that people who are using LSD are able to test whether or not LSD is present using an Ehrlich reagent. Fairly simple one. This is one of the field reagent tests. They've dropped their little tab of acid into the sealed satchel, and you can see it's turned purple there, which means that is LSD. If it was an N-BOM hallucinogen, there would be no colour change in that. So reagent tests can be fooled and they can get confused with multiple ingredients and all different sorts of problems. But in the case of LSD and the Ehrlich reagent, very, very clear response there. No other drugs of concern would make that reaction. And so that's a really viable harm reduction strategy that we need to let people know who might be using LSD. Obviously, people taking ecstasy are a bit used to this because we've had adulterants in ecstasy tablets for ages, and a lot of people are familiar with home reagent test kits for ecstasy. There are a bunch of limitations to those, and the biggest limitation is that they have trouble detecting PMA. And PMA, paramethoxyamphetamine, is a really toxic amphetamine that periodically turns up in Australia. I think South Australia for a long time had the highest ecstasy death rates on Earth because of the PMA that was being produced down there. We had a spate of deaths this was 2013. I think we had 3 or 4 deaths here in Queensland from people consuming PMA. The standard ecstasy field reagent test kit doesn't do a good job of separating PMA from MDMA. They're closely related, and so the colour change is very subtly similar. So also, if PMA and MDMA is mixed together, the reagent's going to be fooled and it's not going to get an accurate result. So there's been a problem with that for a while. We've also recently now seen the N-BOM hallucinogens turning up in ecstasy tablets as well, which is really concerning because they're active in the microgram dose range, and so people are pouring bags of powder into the pill press and just stirring it up. And so we've seen a spate of mass overdoses from N-BOM in ecstasy tablets as well. If anything, the ecstasy tablets are more contaminated now than they ever have been, and some of the contaminants are more risky than they ever have been as well. I know in the early 2000s there was a big push for field testing in festivals, and it's ironic that at that time we didn't really have that many dangerous adulterants around. It was mostly maybe amphetamine, maybe a bit of ketamine. We didn't really have lots of deaths. Now that we've got really dangerous drugs out there, we have got a stronger need than ever before to get this reagent testing out there to the public and happening. Here's some confirmed samples of 2,5-C N-BOM. I think this is David Caldecott confirmed these. The Snapchat pills are still doing the rounds. These contain N-BOM type hallucinogens. They tend to pop up in a city and then they cause a bunch of havoc and then they disappear for 6 months and then turn up on the other side of the country, cause a bit of havoc, disappear again. So we've seen the Snapchat pills now coming out for about the last year, causing problems all over Australia. The standard field reagent test, this is the full range of Easy Test kits that are available. They are rapidly expanding. There is now more and more reagents available for people, and there are different combinations of reagents that can be used to try and narrow down what they might be to try and deal with this problem that we've got. They've just very recently released a reagent which can test for PMA and can differentiate PMA from MDMA. That's a bit of a revolution. You can see there the PMA test colour result down the bottom, and you compare that to MDMA. That's a very subtle colour difference, and if you've got a combination tablet, it's not going to work. But there is at least a reagent that can separate that out. So if people are using more than one reagent, if they combine a Folin reagent with a Markey reagent, they can start to actually narrow it down. It's a really useful exercise for people who are taking ecstasy to start learning about this stuff. It's a great way to educate people about adulterants and about the range of adulterants that are out there and how harmful they can be. Pillreports.com is also a really good educational tool that supports the use of reagent testing. It's also a great educational tool to use with people that are taking ecstasy, to just sit down with them in your office and go to pillreports.com and have a look at the pills that are available at the moment. Nothing does it better than me standing up and telling a young person ecstasy can contain a number of different substances, some of which are very harmful. It isn't really that useful, but showing this from actual people who take ecstasy and the actual actual results they are finding is great education. You can see the bottom result is highlighted in red. That's a dangerous tablet. That's one that the site has identified as potentially dangerous. So you can very quickly go on there and find what the dangerous tablets might be that are in circulation. Obviously, there are problems with this model as well. Dealers can go on there and post that their pills are awesome and give them 5 stars, but there is a peer rating system. So other people will then go on and say, actually, no, that's not true. So, you do have to take some of it with a grain of salt, but it is another strategy to try and use. And just finally, to finish up, the Highway Code is a really great resource for harm reduction. Adam Winstock and Global Drug Survey developed the Highway Code out of Global Drug Survey, because one of the questions they ask in Global Drug Survey is they ask people, what strategies do you take to reduce the harm for your drug taking? How does that strategy impact on your pleasure seeking? And how many of you actually do it? Because we know there's a gap between what we think we should do and what we actually do in reality. We also know people won't implement a harm reduction strategy if it impacts on their pleasure seeking. If it ruins their night out, they're not going to do it. So Highway Code has been able to start ascertaining the ins and outs of those strategies and which ones are more acceptable and less acceptable. And it also gives us as workers an access straight from the horse's mouth about people who take drugs. What are they actually doing? What do they value? What do they see as important? And how are they going at implementing those strategies? So check out the Highway Code for more information on that. And that's all we have time for.
Thanks to Cameron for a really thought-provoking presentation. Is there any questions? We've got time for a couple.
Yes. That would be highly illegal. We know we had 2 deaths in Mackay over Christmas time from some guys who purchased synthetic cannabinoids from a sex shop, despite the fact that they were illegal. So I think, yeah, my answer to that is that the rest of our drug laws haven't really prevented the sale of drugs that much either. So I think we are still seeing this happening. We've also heard, though, anecdotally, in terms of those emerging drugs, I've heard a lot more about how they've just mixed in with the rest of the illicit drugs. So I know lots of, just recently, one of the regional towns in Queensland had another spate of synthetic cannabinoids, all sold through the illicit drug networks. Not through tobacco shops or sex shops. It was just the pot dealers were selling it as an additional product. So I think, if anything, we've just expanded the size of the illicit market, and we've got a grey edge now with these retail stores that might be doing a bit of under-the-counter as well. Why do they do it? Yeah, good question. PMA is made in using exactly the same synthesis as MDMA. The only difference is that it uses aniseed oil, anethol, as the starting agent. So one of the theories as to why we see PMA turning up is that it's actually the illicit chemists are doing a test run. They're doing a test run of the synthesis to see if it works, because aniseed is very easily accessible, whereas safrole, the precursor for MDMA, is highly regulated. So I suspect that illicit chemists don't want to waste the safrole on a synthesis that fails. So instead they just do a test run of aniseed oil and produce PMA, and if it makes a drug, then cha-ching, the synthesis has worked. So I always wondered this, because in South Australia the nickname was Dr. Death, because whenever it was around people would die. And I would think that's not in the interest of illicit drug chemists to produce drugs that kill people, because you're going to attract a lot of attention to your little syndicate by doing that, but it keeps on happening. So I think that might be the reason. Yes, relatively. So they tend to be available either online or in bong shops and head shops. Most of them, the cost varies from about $15 to $30 for one of the reagents. One of the problems with them is, though, that they are highly volatile acids, and they can burn your fingers, and you can, injure yourself using them. They also go off. They also expire. Not always. There are one-off ones which are available, like the little satchel bag that you drop the drug in. Mostly, though, they're vials where you put a few drops of them onto a porcelain plate. But there are issues with handling them and with storage. Some of them need to be refrigerated. Some of them will expire within sort of 6 months and will give zero result after that time. So, sorry, what was that? Not really. In Australia, there's only one manufacturer, so it wouldn't be that hard to find that out. I know the EDRS tends to ask people, have they used them? We often find low rates of people using test kits because of you can't take a test kit to a music festival and a nightclub. Any level of test kit use in a population has the ability to influence the market, though, because if one person in a group of friends tests their pills, that word goes round. So we don't need maximum coverage for it to have an effect, but we do need, though, enough people to use them and results to be shared widely for it to be effective.
Please join me in thanking Cameron.